Hey folks, all right, time for Pandemic Lecture 7. You might notice that I am in the same clothing as Pandemic Lecture 6. That is because I'm recording it right after Pandemic Lecture 6. It is not because I'm just living in this shirt all the time under conditions of pandemic. I am coming to you once again from the paperback paradise. I do not have a new paperback for you to recommend because it's still the same day and because I just recommended something to you in the last video, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to get straight to the discussion of green politics. The discussion really begins with one of my favorite movies all time. I mean, of course, selfishly, that's why it's on the syllabus, but it is also, as I said in a previous email to you all, really about the most relevant movie that I can think of to talk about our current situation in a time of pandemic, although pandemic is not specifically the disaster that happens in Princess Mononoke, but uh, it's connected, and I will make that point here in just a second. Okay, so please refer to the PowerPoint slides. The first couple of slides there that I just have. One is a movie poster, original movie poster from Japan. I'm assuming with two of the characters from Princess Mononoke. That would be San, who is essentially Princess Mononoke, the Beast Princess, and then Moro, so the Wolf God, who is her wolf mother, and you see there part of the kind of discussion. So I've got the quotation at the top of that page. I can't forgive the humans. That's, of course, what San says at the end of the film after the catastrophe. And there's a kind of process of maybe starting to rebuild the world. Nevertheless, she is holding on to her righteous anger against what the humans have done to nature. And juxtapose that with the following slide. That's slide number 3, which you see there's that conversation between Ashitaka and San. What I want is for the humans and the forest to live in peace, says Ashitaka. And so there we see, this movie is really presenting us with, well, there are a whole lot of sides in this movie, but there's certainly multiple sides, even in the kind of the pro-environmentalist camp, I guess, if you want to say, as represented in the film. Ashitaka's, more harmonious approach and San's approach that really holds out a more agonistic or conflict ridden human nature relationship based on what the humans have done to nature. Okay, so let's move on to slide 4. And let me just say a little something about the film more generally. So Miyazaki, that's the director, Hayao Miyazaki, he's created a fable of the past. This is a fable of kind of medieval Japan, essentially. But it's really going back to the past in order to rethink our present and our future. It's also rethinking our past, but by confronting us with this kind of early moment where humans begin to seriously encroach on the natural environment, and then what results from that. I think this is a really an amazing film to be to be talking about in the time of COVID-19. There were already folks, and you can find opinion pieces where people are comparing Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish climate activist, to Princess Mononoke, to San. We're basically seeing Greta and San as really analogous kinds of figures, kind of warriors for the environment in a certain sense, and that those parallels still apply. But I think when we think about the way that this pandemic is also a kind of human ecological catastrophe, that it is a direct result of human interference in nature, of the live animal markets specifically. And I don't mention this in the slide, but really all the recent pandemics, this is our situation. So it wasn't a pandemic, but mad cow disease in the 20th century, SARS, H1N1, now COVID-19, even Ebola. All of these are coming to the human societies because of our relationships with non-human animals, and specifically exploitation of them, oftentimes for food. Not always for food, but in the case of COVID-19, that's absolutely the case. So we see, this parallel of human intervention in nature, and then the blowback. So we see this in the film. We see this with COVID-19, and we also see the way that the humans in the film are not really. Many of them are not really interested in working together. Right? They are all, even in the midst of the catastrophe, or even as the catastrophe is beginning and then unfolding, they're all more interested in their petty squabbles, their human warfare, than they are in the actual collapse of the ecosystem upon which they depend. So again, we see, parallels in the film to the kind of political conflict that continues even in the middle of a crisis, where people are just not able to come together to actually deal with the catastrophe as it's unfolding. And the film leaves us with a question, not a resolution, right? I mentioned that sort of dialectic or tension between San and Ashitaka at the end. There's no one perspective that this film is giving us. It's giving us multiple perspectives for how to think about the human relationship with nature, and whether that should be an exploitative relationship, as with various people, Lady Eboshi and others, the Emperor, Lord Osuno, and others earlier in the film, and Jigo monk. There are all those perspectives, but then even between San and Ashitaka, who want to offer some kind of respectful relationship to nature, their differences. So the film is not giving us any easy answers. It's presenting us with a crisis, a catastrophe, and a problem, and then a set of responses. And it's really for us to really work through that. So if you look to then slide 5, so just to think a little more specifically about the way the crisis works. So in the film, it's the human wish to extend human life. So to make human life better in certain senses, that's Irontown, and what they're doing with extracting the iron to make weapons from the land of the forest. And then the quest to kill the forest spirit is because the emperor wants eternal life, and thinks that the forest spirit is going to, taking the head from the forest spirit is going to give him that. But all of it, we can think about all of this, as depicting still a kind of more general situation in which humans are centered on themselves and want to protect their life, secure their life, and preserve their life kind of infinitely, and are willing to take whatever steps necessary toward the goal that they think they have, which is basically this self-interested goal, and they're willing to instrumentalize and exploit nature without regard to the consequences. Of course, in the film, then we see that the consequence is that nature bites back, right? Taking the head from the Nightwalker results in a kind of revenge, a kind of curse, as that sort of black or dark liquid oozes from the dead or dying forest spirit, which is just it's destroying life, right? So the idea of humans exploiting life, you can do that for a while, but eventually it results in a kind of spillover, or a kind of blowback, and a mutually reinforcing cycle of bad consequences, in which life then begins in a cascade to collapse, right? That is what is being depicted. And so there is also a kind of revenge that we see in what happens with the Nightwalker, and then what happens to all of the life in the forest. And it's not just going after humans, but it's just all life is being taken away. We can see that as a kind of revenge of the Nightwalker, and COVID in some sense can be seen in this way too, as a kind of revenge, not intentional revenge. One doesn't have to believe in a kind of spirit out there in nature, but it's a kind of cautionary tale about exploiting natural entities and not actually taking account of them, and then the ill effects that will rebound to humans because of neglecting that relationship, because not thinking about that relationship as a mutual relationship, but as a relationship that is just for the exclusive benefit of humans. So we can see the multiple failures that are tracked by the thinkers for this set of readings: Singer and Plumwood and Thiele, speciesism, the quest for mastery, the neglect of sustainability. All of these are echoed in various ways in the film. Okay, so if you go to slide 6, let's just start with Peter Singer. So we'll talk Singer and then Plumwood and then Thiele and then Cohn and then wrap up. So Singer's animal liberation revolutionizes moral and political philosophy by adding speciesism as a term, as a concept, where before racism and sexism were central concepts for critiquing the limitations, the failures of a kind of liberal political order. Now Singer adds in this, that look, an irrational bias for one's own species leads to a denial of the principle that otherwise we basically embrace, that equal consideration of interests is what is requisite. Consider similar interests similarly. Singer says we basically believe that to be a true moral principle. Equal consideration of interests is a moral principle that we generally endorse, but we take an exceptionalist position where we say, but we're only going to apply that to our species and we're not going to apply that to other species. But he says this is a similar move to the racists and the sexists, that previously racists would say, well, yes, equal consideration of interest, but only white people or white Europeans count. Everybody else, it doesn't really count. We don't have to treat similars similarly. We don't have to grant equal consideration of interest to those who are not in our particular racial group. Similarly with sexism, using that as a principle of exception to say, well, no, it only applies to men and doesn't apply to women, right, as was done in the past. So Singer says we should take this principle seriously and just remove that exception where we don't assume that species gives us the right, that it's just the interests of our own species give us the right to just neglect all other interests. Singer says this doesn't mean that pigs get the right to vote. It also means that men don't get the right to have abortions because men can't have abortions, right? Male bodies. Of course, he's talking in a time when we thought a little bit more differently about biology and gender, so just bear that in mind. But so trans activists would have a claim or a criticism of the way he presented that. So but put that in parentheses for the moment. But the idea for him is, look, pigs don't have a relevant way of voting, and so it's not that they get a right to vote. They should get an equal consideration of their interests, which means they should get certain protections and maybe not be treated to a short, brutal life in a factory farm and then being, served up on someone's dinner plate, but that doesn't mean they need to get the right to vote. Similarly, we don't think that there's anything wrong with men and women having equal rights, but recognizing that a woman might have a right to an abortion, whereas a man might not actually have that right. But we don't say that means that men and women don't have equal rights, right? It just means that women's particular bodies and their particular position means that equality would, for women, necessitates a right to abortion, whereas it doesn't for men. But that's equal consideration of interest. That's still the principle of equal consideration of interests. Okay. The next slide, slide 7. So talking about interests, we need to talk about what he says about interests. Animals have interests like humans, not the same as, but they have interests, just as humans have interests, because they are sentient, meaning mainly that they are capable of sensing and suffering. They feel pleasure, they feel pain, and they have sensation. Now, other animal rights folks will say that they have a kind of basic autonomy. They have their lives are, they have a kind of center of a life. They have a kind of internal subjectivity and view of the world and the way that they orchestrate their lives, and they have certain purposes, even if they don't have linguistic facility to explain those purposes. That Singer is not focused on that. It's just sentience for him. So he says what speciesists do is they say, to have interest means that you need to have reason and language and speech, and if you don't have those, then you don't really have interest that we need to take account for or account of. Singer follows the early utilitarian political theorist Jeremy Bentham, who said that interests, both human and animal, are based on the capacity for suffering. That's all you need to know. You don't need to know if someone can talk. You don't need to know if someone can reason. What you need to know is, can they suffer? Can they suffer pain? And also, do they have a capacity for pleasure? If they do, then you need to take account of their interests in some way. Bentham has said that in the early 1800s. Singer says that is the principle that we should be adhering to in the present. Okay, so why the denial? So this is slide 8. Why do humans not why do they not grant this, even though they grant, basically most people grant intuitively the principle that equal consideration of interests is a good principle? Well, he says, we deny animals these rights because it's basically easy to deny rights to groups when they seem to conflict with your own. The thing is, he says, this is, in our case, it's basically our interest is just in the taste of animals. We don't need to eat animals to survive. Now, there might be certain indigenous communities, this is not something that Singer gets into here, there might be certain indigenous communities where there is a real necessity, let's say, to eat animals, or at least you could make that argument. I'm not saying Singer would agree or would disagree, but just hold that to the side for the moment. Singer is talking about basically in Western liberal democracies, no one needs to eat animals in order to be healthy. You have plenty of sources of nutrition without eating animal products or byproducts, and basically it's just taste. People like the way animals taste, and so they're willing to put their interest in just having a nice taste, the taste that they like, over the much more substantial, in Singer's view, interest that the animal has in not being subjected to confinement, cruel treatment, painful death, and then being served up on someone's dinner table. So, second, he says that it's common for powerful groups to be essentially blind to the claims of those they exclude. Sexists did this in the past, when until the early 1900s, women were entirely denied the right to vote, right? Across the world, this was just not a thing that was recognized. Men were simply blind to those claims for equal consideration of interest from women. Similarly, slave owners, simply blind to these considerations, excluded groups and just ignored them because it was in their interests as the powerful group to continue that oppression and exploitation. So Singer says it's not surprising, it's not okay that we do this, but it's not surprising. Powerful groups all the time just look past the interests of the groups that they oppress. And he also says it's also just bad philosophy. On the bad philosophy, that's our next slide number 9. So he says philosophers have come up with all kinds of ways of justifying to themselves why it's okay to exploit animals. And they usually do it by some form of concepts like dignity or inherent moral worth. So the idea is somehow, from the bad philosophy standpoint, that humans have dignity or inherent moral worth, and somehow humans have that just because, and animals don't. So therefore, it's okay to treat humans in a protected way, give them rights, not exploit, not harm. But animals don't get that. The problem for these bad philosophers, Singer says, is they don't really have a very good way of explaining what these are based on. And in particular, they don't have a way of protecting or arguing against what he calls the argument from marginal cases. So the problem as Singer sees it is that there is no human capacity that is so widely shared to include infants, to include the severely disabled, everyone. So it has to include all humans. There's no actual capacity that includes all humans that doesn't also include some animals. So if you're talking about the capacity to reason, etc., or linguistic capacities or whatever, if you say, well, infants basically have it, or the severely disabled basically have it, well, then there are a whole bunch of animals that actually have those kinds of capacities as well. Chimpanzees, I mean, it depends depending on what your specific argument is, but chimpanzees or dolphins or dogs or pigs have all of these capacities that are similar to the capacities that human infants or toddlers or severely disabled humans have. So he says, what people then try to do is they try to say, oh, well, we're just going to say that we're talking about the normal human. And so because an infant is going to develop, supposedly will develop into that normal human, they get the benefit for that. So that's why you can't harm infants. You shouldn't harm infants, even if they don't have the capacities that a normal functioning human does. So no dog can ever develop into that. So even though a dog and an infant might have similar capacities, the claim goes, the infant is going to develop, whereas the dog won't. But he says this is an irrational prejudice, and this is an irrational argument, and it's also linked to the way that sexists and racists tried to make their kinds of discriminations. So the argument for marginal cases, Singer says, it just doesn't work. If you're going to exclude animals, you need to exclude some people from the consideration, from equal consideration of interests. Singer says, why not do what our moral intuition actually tells us we should do, which is to, if we're going to base it on certain kind of capacities, and let's say it's the capacity to experience joy and the capacity to fear, the capacity to suffer and the capacity to fear suffering, well, then we're going to include a whole bunch of animals too. That's what our intuition tells us, and so that's what we should actually do. So give animal interests their due, stop eating them, stop experimenting on them, stop wearing their skins, stop using them for entertainment in zoos, in circuses, etc. That's what equal consideration of interest demands. It doesn't demand that pigs get the right to vote, and it's going to be different depending on different kinds of animals, depending on their different capacities. But cruel treatment and eating them in the way that we eat them in under conditions of animal agriculture today, Singer says those kind of things simply can't stand up to scrutiny. Okay, let's talk about Val Plumwood, and then we'll talk about Les Thiele and James Cone. Actually, I think what I might do is I might just talk about Plumwood, and well, let's see how this goes, and I might actually break this up into another lecture. Because I know you say, oh, I want Pandemic Lecture 8, right? Okay, we'll see how it goes. So Plumwood was an Australian ecofeminist philosopher. If you want to get an interesting read or have an interesting read, there's a discussion that she has about being attacked by a crocodile, sort of out in the wild in the outback in Australia, and what it's like to really feel like prey. That's really quite interesting. So just you can Google that. Oh my gosh, I just realized I didn't do the theme for today, the soundtrack. So let me just say, so back up, and my recommendation is Grimes has a new album called Misanthropocene. So Miss Anthropocene, but it also is Misanthropy. That's in there. So that's an album that is designed for times of crisis and catastrophe. So let me just say, go back, rewind all this, go back, go listen to Grimes while I'm talking. Okay. So Plumwood is more concerned with nature and kind of holistics and ecosystems than she is concerned with the specific animal rights and domesticated animal rights in the way that Singer is. I should say also that Singer he's a utilitarian philosopher, and so he's actually not interested necessarily in rights per se, but more generally in kind of consideration of animal welfare. It might not necessarily take the form of animal rights. So if you're hearing what I'm saying and saying, oh, but Singer's a utilitarian, he doesn't like rights, yeah, that's true, but it's kind of past the point or beside the point that I'm making with him. Okay, back to Plumwood. So Plumwood is targeting the exploiters of nature, but she's also targeting other ecofeminists. So she actually has twin targets in this piece. She's targeting anthropocentrists, those who believe that humans, and the anthropos, are the center of the moral philosophical universe, that humans are the only ones who are really kind of important in the world. And she's also tying her critique of anthropocentrism to androcentrism, to the way a specific form of male domination has gone hand in hand with the exploitation of nature. However, she says, there is no what she calls angel in the ecosystem. So early ecofeminists had a tendency of equating women with nature and saying that there was some kind of peaceful, harmonious essence to what it is to be a woman that more essentially ties women to natural systems, to non-human entities. And that's the angel in the ecosystem that Plumwood is talking about and is criticizing. So Plumwood says it is not about some essential tie, essential connection between women's biology and nature. That is not, so there are other ecofeminists who make that argument. Plumwood is very critical of that argument. She says women are historically linked with nature, have historically been seen as being closer to nature and as being less than men. That men were seen as the arbiters of culture, men were seen as the kind of supreme example of what it is to be a human being, as a kind of a culture-rated man, and that women, through being more emotional, through being weaker, through being sort of more subject to emotions, which was seen as being more closely tied with the whims and vagaries of nature, Plumwood says that is a cultural construction. That is not an essential construction. So women have been culturally constructed as being closer to nature, but there's no essential tie there. So what we have to criticize, she says, is the way that particular cultures have equated human nature with the domination of nature. So she says, we have for too long thought that what it means to be human is what we are as humans is creating culture over and opposed to nature, and that we are supposed to dominate and control nature in order to fully become human. And that, she says, is the main thing that ecofeminists ought to be targeting and criticizing, that we have been acculturated into that view. So it's not that human culture needs to be based on exploiting and oppressing nature. It's that our particular culture has trained us to think that that is what culture is. So we've been in a kind of matrix. We've been in Plato's cave, trained to think that what it is to be human is to define ourselves as opposed to nature and to master nature, and that's the matrix that we need to get out of. So if you go to slide 11, Les Paul Thiele. Oh, maybe I'm going to be able to get through this. We'll see. His last name is it looks like Thiele. It's pronounced Thiele. At least I believe it's pronounced Thiele. I don't know. Maybe someone's going to see this and contact him and tell me I'm wrong. But I've met him, and I'm pretty sure that's how it's pronounced. Anyway, so he continues the green politics critique. Along with Plumwood, he would say humans should not think of ourselves as masters of nature. We ought to think of ourselves not as masters, but as plain citizens of nature. And here he is following the ecological theorist, environmental philosopher Aldo Leopold. And Aldo Leopold talked about thinking like a mountain, thinking about being in tune kind of holistically with nature, with the biotic community. A thing is right, and just quoting from Leopold, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. So a kind of larger community of life, not just a human community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So Thiele is going to defend this idea of a land ethic. So it's not just about individual animals getting rights, but it's about thinking about the good of the whole system, about the whole biotic community, which might mean a particular ecosystem, but more generally we can think about the globe, the Earth, as a giant biotic community. So that's what we need to be thinking like. We need to be thinking that instead of viewing ourselves as masters who dominate nature, we are just citizens of this biotic community. We may have special abilities that other species don't, but we should just try to think of ourselves as citizens engaged in mutual respectful relations with the other citizens, which is all kinds of other non-human entities, animals, plants, mountains even in the world. Sorry, I need to have This is a very non-natural drink that I'm having, but I need my Diet Pepsi here. Hold on. Oh, that feels good. Okay, so we ignore our connection with the wider community on which our lives depend, and we wrongly think that we're the ones who are in control. In fact, it is nature that is in control. It's an illusion that we believe that we are in control. We've changed the climate without meaning to, but we are all in this, what he calls deep complexity. Everything is connected. We are altering systems, climate systems, ecosystems, without having recognized until fairly recently that we were doing these things. Again, all because we thought of ourselves as the masters of nature, and that we didn't have to think about any of the other creatures out there in the world. But it's now coming back to bite us, right? So we are now changing the climate in ways that actually much more directly impact human life as well. So it's all tied together. We can't just exploit nature without it coming back to us. Again, you see the connection with Princess Mononoke. So go to the next slide, slide 12. So sustainability is kind of a new buzzword. It's been around for a few years now, but it's become a kind of cliche. And so Thiele is concerned with the way that there is a kind of cliched usage of sustainability. It can actually mean something, and it can be something to mobilize around if we think about it critically. So we have to think about political and economic structures that are not going to be destroying our children's futures, and also the children of other species. So we are currently engaged in the 6th great extinction. Human beings are causing a global catastrophe, a global extinction event. Humans are now doing that. There have been 5 in the entire history of the planet. We're now engineering the 6th one. We don't have to allow that to happen. He says we can actually create spaces both for the garden, what he calls the garden, and the wilderness. So gardens are human, spaces where humans interact in more thoughtful, intentional ways, cultivating non-human entities, as one does in a garden with the plants. Those kinds of interactions can still exist, but we also have to have a much more robust way of protecting wilderness, the spaces in the world that are not going to be interfered with by human beings. We can have both, but we need to much more seriously address this, that a sustainable system, a sustainable world is not a world that is just, paved over, that where everything is, where the only things that are grown in hothouses or something, and otherwise everything is paved. That might be sustainable. It might technically be something that can continue on into the future, but it's not valuing and respecting all of the other current citizens of the globe in all the other species, animal, plant, etc. So Thiele says we can combine people and plants and the planet and profit, but it means that we have to confront all of the difficult bargains that we are constantly being asked to strike. So he has this example of thinking about, having a cell phone in the forest, right? So there is a role for having a cell phone in the forest, maybe to call for help or what have you. But that means that you only have that because other forests elsewhere have been sacrificed in order to create that cell phone. So you need to think about the costs of all of the little technological gadgets that we have and ask ourselves in a much more reflective way, a much more critical way, are these things actually worth it? Is the cell phone or the new piece of clothing or whatever, or the new car or the building, the nice new building that I want, are all of those things worth the sacrifices that we have to impose on the other citizens of the biological community, of the biotic community? And he says mainly we don't ask ourselves those questions. We don't actually try to think about how profit is actually affecting other people around the globe and other species, other citizens of our planet. So we can bring these things together. It means there are difficult trade-offs. It doesn't mean that there are easy answers, but it means that we constantly have to have those questions and sort of confront the real costs of our actions. Okay, so let's talk about James Cone. I'm going to actually just try to power on through here. I'm going to talk about Cone and then I'm going to wrap us up. So Cone is going to bring together, again, he's an American political thinker and also an American theologian, and he is going to bring together ecological and critical race perspectives. He is very critical of what he calls green bigotry, of the way that white environmentalists basically think about protecting whales and think about protecting wilderness areas, but they basically ignore the environmental racism that is harming people of color, in various communities across these supposedly advanced liberal democracies. So, environmental racism can take many forms, but most typically it would be the way that polluting facilities or garbage dumps or factories are placed in poorer areas of cities, but also oftentimes placed within communities that are, people of color, communities of color. And so these essentially create sacrifice zones, areas where those people are forced to endure terrible environmental conditions, all the soot and all the pollutants that are coming out from those factories. They have to endure those in that particular community supposedly for the sake of the greater good of the society, to have those factories or what have you. But the costs are being imposed on those particular communities of color. So, and COVID actually has this aspect as well. So there's just recent data out of a couple of American states that show that African Americans are suffering in much greater percentages than white Americans. For a variety of reasons. We don't know all of the reasons specifically, but there's a differential impact. And so that would also be a kind of environmental racism. So Cone is critical of social justice advocates are focused on just humans. So he's got the critical race component where he's concerned with how communities of color are being neglected, but he's also critical of the way that social justice advocates might only be concerned with human social justice. So he says we have to talk about both of these together. So he's a kind of intersectional theorist, but who is molding or blending in also ecosystems and non-human animals. So he's seeking this intersectional approach that widens. Again, I know I mentioned Martin Luther King Jr.'s concept of the beloved community many times. He's going to widen this to include animals and plants. But he says to his readers, you've got to pick a side now. Like you have to either be for the planet or for capital, or for class hierarchy and imperialism. You can't, given the climate crisis, given the way the environment is actually responding now to the human effect on it, you have to act now. You don't have any more time to just sort of dilly-dally. Okay, final couple of slides here. So that's Cone. So slide 14, after the catastrophe. Okay, hang on. I need another Diet Wild Cherry Pepsi. That's good YouTube. Me drinking a Pepsi. So after the catastrophe, the Nightwalker is killed. Its spirit is going to seek revenge on all forms of life, right? It's not just the humans. It's like anything that gets in the path of the sort of goop that's coming from the Nightwalker is going to die. Even after San, things seem to get back to rightness, to normalcy, to order when Ashitaka and San return the head to the forest spirit, and it appears that the ending is life is beginning to arise again, right? The little Kodama tree spirits begin to come back on the hillsides. So it seems that there isn't after the catastrophe. Life is going to go on, but it's really not clear how life is going to go on. And we are left with as many questions at the end, as we had at the beginning. Where's the civilization going to go? Ashitaka is seeking harmony between humans and the forest, or humans and nature. San is still very angry about what has been done, and she does not want to forgive the humans. So, to take up the perspectives and to bring those into the present, right? How do we reconcile humans with nature, with non-humans? Is there an easy way that there can be some kind of harmony, or how do we deal with the injustice of the past, of all of the harms that humans have committed in the moment up till now, and into the future? And does there have to be some sort of reparations or some sort of greater sacrifice that humans should impose on themselves in order to restore? So it's not just about harmony going forward, but that humans actually have to sort of bear some of the guilt for what has been done. I think that's implicit in what San is saying. So for her, it's not just an easy sort of harmony going into the future. There is still rage on her part. Lady Eboshi says that she wants to build a better Irontown. What does that look like? Can there be an Irontown in the first place, or could there be a better Irontown that is not still exploiting nature? So, again, we have questions. We have a civilization in the movie after a catastrophe, after an ecological catastrophe, and we don't have any clear picture about how to go forward, but we know that there are these different ideas or ideologies about how to go forward, and we're really, posed with a set of questions by Miyazaki. How to go forward, right? How to go forward. This is our question now as well. Okay, so let me just close with kind of final couple of reflections about the semester and about you and the world. So I hope that this class has been a kind of small contribution toward giving you all some intellectual independence. I hope, I don't know what it will be for you, but that certainly is one of the things that I hope it helps with you going forward. I think, and this is connected with what I'm saying about independence, people are trying to manipulate you. Politicians, not just politicians, but folks on all sides. You can call them special interests. I mean, you can say, professors, whomever, people on all sides of the political spectrum are trying to manipulate you. And I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. They're trying to convince you that their view of the world is right. And they're going to present you with kind of biased or prejudiced versions of reality, not because they're evil, but because they only see that one part of reality, and some of them will deny that the other parts of reality exist. And so you have all of these different voices who are trying to pull you in their direction, and this can be confusing, and it can also lead to something that is now being termed reality apathy. That when you don't know what to make of reality, when there are too many confusing perspectives, you're just inclined to give up. Or one can be inclined to just give up, to say this is too damn difficult to figure out what's going on, who's lying, who's telling the truth. I just don't care. I'm just going to retreat back into myself and do what I can for myself, and I'm not going to concern myself with any of these other bigger things because it's just too confusing. I hope that this class will help you to fight that reality apathy. To dig deeper, to go beyond the YouTubeization of political discussion. I know that I'm presenting this on YouTube. I'm aware of the irony of that. Different ideologies, this is my point 3, different political ideologies are not going to go away. We are going to be in a world with pluralism, with radically different views of what is right and how to live as individuals, and also how to organize ourselves politically. It's up to you to figure out what groups you're going to coexist with, what ideologies you want to make peace with, and also which ones you're going to struggle with, right? Whom are you going to oppose? What are you going to stand up for? What are you going to sacrifice for? You can't know which is which. You can't really know who to go along with and whom to struggle against unless you've actually done serious work to make sure that you're not just getting that one little echo chamber view of the world. I'm not saying be open to everything, but I'm saying trying to put yourself in other people's shoes, which means walking in the shoes, intellectually of those whom you oppose, is a really useful thing. It's not just useful because it's going to help you actually sort of be more effective in the world, engage more effectively in the world, but it's just going to help you think. It's going to help you understand yourself, and maybe it will create for you greater sympathy with some of these groups that you're opposed to. On the other hand, I'm not saying it's all kumbaya. There's some groups that you probably should struggle against and oppose. But it's only through sort of inhabiting their world a little bit mentally that you're going to be able to do that in a more effective way. So let me move to my final slide then. For me, this is all really what political science is about. So we've been talking about political ideology in this class, and so this is a political theory class. So it's more theoretical, more philosophical than a sort of empirical political science class. But all of this is still very much about political science. It's about gaining knowledge of the world, and here we've been gaining knowledge specifically of the kind of ideas, the norms, the values that people have, gaining knowledge of the world in the search for purpose, in the search for actually deciding how we want to live as individuals and how we want to live together as groups in political society. So political science brings these two things together. It's knowledge of the world, in that kind of more scientific manner, trying to figure out what is true and what is not, and then linking that with the political, which is about value, which is about struggling for the things that you believe in, which is about purpose, which is about the goals that you seek. And to put that back into the terminology of this course in point 5 there, what kind of agent are you? What do you seek? What do you want to overcome? So who is important to you, right? Who are you standing up for the rights of nature? Are you standing up for the rights of individual humans? Are you standing up for societal, groups or families? Maybe as conservatives would be more inclined to. What's the center of importance for you, right? Different kinds of species, biotic communities, or different kinds of human communities, or different ideas of the human individual. Who's the agent, right? Who do you stand up for? And what do you seek on behalf of that center of value, whomever you think it is? And what are you going to have to overcome? What are the challenges to that agent, to that center of value, in order to gain the purposes which you seek? And also I add there, and how can listening to your enemy, or those whom you think is your enemy, how can that actually help you in figuring out who you are and what you want to defend and what your center of value is going to be. Let me just close then by saying that this moment of pandemic, this crisis is going to be one that's going to define your lifetime. It's like nothing I've ever seen. I'm 50, and and there have been other big moments before, but this is really reshaping the world. We can't change the fact that we're here, right? To put it in the terms of Princess Mononoke, we can't alter our fate, but what we can try to do is rise to meet it. And I hope that this class will help you in some way in giving you the ability to rise to the challenge of this moment, because this is a really just epochal, sea change of a moment. I don't know what the future is going to look like after this, but things are going to be changing in a big way. And I hope somehow that I've helped to prepare you for that. Okay, I will sign off. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Thank you.